Try not to think about all the things people could have done on this pair of bed sheets. Hello my loves, I'm Miss MonMon. Welcome to my channel. Today we are embarking on a vintage sewing adventure, and I want to make a dress out of some 1970s retro, aggressively floral bed sheets. So that's what we're doing. First up, I am so sorry about the noise happening outside my window. There's really nothing I can do about that, and they start at 7 AM and go all day. I'm doing my best to edit out the noise, but there's not much I can do when it comes to machinery of that size. If you sew or do any fabric craft, you will know it is not cheap. Fabric can get very expensive, even if you try to do it on a budget. There is a lot of fabric waste. There is so much thread and offcut that it can be quite detrimental to the environment, and there are ways to use all those scraps, but sometimes it's not always viable. So in an attempt to try and be kinder to the environment, I wanted to try and find non-conventional fabrics. And by that I mean I didn't just go to a fabric store and buy some fabric. I have always really liked vintage bed sheets. I don't actually have any that I sleep in, but I have started slowly accumulating a small collection, which I am hoping to use as fabric. I was recently browsing some of my Facebook feed and I found someone selling a pair of 1970s bed sheets, and I fell in love with the pattern. It is a really odd color combination and it shouldn't work, but I just love it. Anything that's aggressively floral, I'm sold on. So this is the fabric we're going to use, and I have I think this was a twin flat, which is quite a lot of material and is also a great width. The problem with having bed sheets is sometimes you get odd staining, and this one has a couple of holes in it and some questionable stains. So here lies the challenge in using this bed sheet with a pattern and trying to make the pieces fit. Speaking of pattern, here's the one I want to use. This is Blackmore 8673, and Blackmore is a old pattern designer, and I think they stopped creating patterns in the 40s. So even though this was listed in the 50s, when I bought it on Etsy, I think it's actually from the 40s because they stopped making them in the 1940s. So we have our fabric, we have our pattern. Let's make a dress out of a vintage bedsheet.
Oh hey, it's voiceover MonMon here. As this is a 1940s pattern, it came with no seam allowance. So when I laid all my pattern pieces on my fabric, being very careful to avoid as many stains and holes as I could, I added the 1/2 inch seam allowance that the pattern suggests. This was my first time doing something like this, and I just got my little water soluble marker and added little dots for me to cut along. And I think seeing how it turns out in the end, it turned out pretty good. So this is something that you can all do as well. I used some pins to mark out the bigger stains and holes, so when placing my patterns I could avoid them, and that was the best way to try and utilize this fabric as best as possible. Once everything was cut out, I started by sewing in some darts into the bodice, and there were darts at the front and back. Once done, I sewed the front and the back of the bodice together, leaving the front pieces split because this is joined at the front with buttons and not at the back with a zip. This is all we have to do for the bodice at the moment, as we can't attach the facing until the skirt is sewn on. So let's move on to that. If you've ever had a pattern like this, you will know that the instructions are very limited. It basically just tells you add pleats. So to do that, using a few marks that were on the pattern pieces, I created 2 lines down the middle of my skirt pieces, 4 in total. Once these lines were marked, I brought the 2 lines together in a fold, much like I would do with a dart. and I pinned it together. What I was planning to do was to baste stitch along this line and keep it together until the very end of the dress, when I would just unpick it and ta-da, we would have an inverted pleat. I repeated this process to all 4 of the pieces until I was left with this. Here is my bodice laid down next to all my skirt pieces, and you can see where I have basted them when the pattern goes a little bit jagged. It'll work out in the end. It was now time for a quick cup of tea before moving on to sewing all the skirt pieces together, once again leaving the front center open as this would be replaced with buttons. I sewed a basting stitch along the top of the skirt before I attach it to the bodice. This just means that all the pleats that I attached will be folded down. As you can see, I have folded them into the middle and ironed them, so that way they sort of have a box pleat vibe to them. And once that was done, I went ahead and attached it to the waistline of my bodice. With the bodice and skirt now attached, it was time to focus on things like the facing and the straps. So starting with the straps, I cut out the pattern pieces, folded them in half and sewed them down the middle. I then flipped them inside out and really wished I had my dress mannequin or someone with me who could help me place them, because I pinned them a little bit wonky. So one is mildly leaning, but that's the joy of homemade. It goes without saying that in between all my steps, I used my pinking shears to try and seal my fabric, so keep that in mind. Moving on to the facing, I sewed the front and back together, and I did use a piece of scrap green fabric because I wanted to save as much of the bedsheet as possible. And then I pinned the facing all along the edge of my dress. I also made sure that my sleeves were put in at this point because you can't really put them in after neatly. The last massive bit of sewing was sewing all around the edge, attaching the facing to the dress. I went around and trimmed and clipped corners before hemming the inside of the facing. I don't normally do this, but I wanted to give it extra strength, especially because they will be supporting buttons and they had no interfacing. If I was at home, I would absolutely add interfacing because it'll just give it a bit of extra strength. Because the 70s were all about the vibe, I really wanted to add some of the vibe. So I added a decorative top stitch all the way around the dress. I really liked the green thread that I had, it matched perfectly, so it just gave it a really cute touch. After learning how to use my buttonhole maker on my really awful machine, I practiced on this coaster. Yes, that's my coaster. And then added 12 buttonholes all the way down one side of my dress. Once I get home, I will definitely add some fray check, as the stitching on these buttonholes wasn't as compacted as I would like, so I just want to give them a little bit of extra strength. Although not filmed, I did attach all the buttons by hand, but I did them the next day when I had an appointment because I knew I would be sitting there for about 45 minutes doing nothing, and I'm one of those people who I don't like to sit around and do nothing, so that is when I attached all my buttons. To continue with the theme of adding pointless top stitch, I measured out about 1.5 inches from the side of the buttons and added a decorative top stitch all the way down to make it look like it's a panel. I was actually inspired by the Bedsheets, which had this really cute lace, and had it enough lace I would have added that in, but it didn't. So I'm just adding this top stitch panel to both sides because I think it'll look really cute and a little bit more finished. The last 2 things I needed to do with this dress was iron on one of my brand new personalized labels, which I am obsessed with. It's honestly one of my favorite Christmas presents that I got. So I go ahead and iron that on, and the back isn't sticky, which is kind of nice, so you can fiddle around with it before you add the iron, and then the glue will adhere. They are also not itchy, which is always a plus. And the last thing I needed to do was to hem my dress. Once she was hemmed, it was done. So let's have a look at how it turned out.
I kind of love this dress, even though the process of making it I found really tedious, really frustrating, and as a visual learner, having just written instructions was a little bit confusing, so I honestly kind of made it up as I went along. There are a few issues with this dress, mainly the sleeves. They aren't uneven. One is more angled than the other, so they don't quite sit. So I think at a later point I will unpick it and re-sew it just along the top. Regardless, I think this is a great and fun way of using up some vintage bed sheets, or even just bed sheets that you don't plan on using. I think this came out pretty cute. 10 out of 10, I would use these bed sheets again for a different pattern, but I'm not 100% sure if I would go back to this pattern and use it. So what do you think? Do you think vintage bed sheets are great as fabric, or should they just stay as bed sheets? I like it as a dress. I really want to find this fabric again and make it into something different because it's so cute. I'm hoping to sew a couple of more dresses out of some vintage bed sheets that I have been collecting, but it honestly takes such prep work to even cut into it because I am terrified of making something that doesn't stack up to having vintage fabric be cut into. It's a weird sewing thing. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. If you'd like any more information on this project and this pair of bed sheets as well, I have all that in my blog, which you can find in the description box below, as well as photos of my final make. I will be back next week with a brand new video, but please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, or find me on any of my social media. I'd love to have you guys follow my adventures there and get to interact with you all a little bit more. I will see you next week with a brand new video, but until then, be kind, be true, be you, and have a absolutely fantastic week. Bye!